Hi, my name is Kevin Mack, and this is my second video, but this is really a follow-up from the previous video that I posted, which was on BEM. I got some questions about the methodology, and in my last video I talked about a presentation that I did previously, and I thought maybe I would make an abridged version of it so you could quickly go through it. And if you want to have the details of it, this is also on YouTube, the full version of it. I think it's about an hour long, but I thought maybe this would be also helpful for a really quick lesson. BEM is going to be very important in other videos, so I find it very critical for everyone to really understand it for moving forward on the other videos that I'll be making. So I wanted to walk through this older presentation. It's called Mind Bending, Rethinking Web Development, and it's all about BEM and an introduction to it. So really getting the first little overview, which is on web development. And there's a lot of assumptions when it comes to web development and things that people have been doing for a long time. I started web development in '95, and from there I've learned a lot. And a lot of those initial, rules that were being written back then still align today, but people started moving away farther and farther away from them. And then different schools of thoughts and methodologies came into play. And most of the time, where the front end kind of fell apart was HTML, CSS, are really easy to learn. You can teach someone CSS in a few minutes. You can learn HTML in a few moments. And with that, people think that these languages are really easy, but in reality, they're some of the most complex development languages. Because of that, a lot of assumptions come out of it. And this is my first one here. So the first assumption is that the code is quality. Everyone thinks that when you're moving into a project, or if you're inheriting a project or you're going to be developing on it, that the code is going to be quality, which we all know it's not. And you'll hear something like, just update that. This is one of those quotes that literally everyone says at least one time on a project, or you'll hear this quote from someone like the project manager or potentially the client, or someone will say this to you and it's just like, all right, just update that. It's just a little change and it won't affect anything. That's a very common thing. But then you go and you update one line of code, and for the landing page or the home page, and then you go into the contact us page and everything's broken. So there's all these really tied pieces of code, but you make one update and it cascades throughout the entire project and it can cause chaos. And when you have code that isn't really quality, maintenance as well as scaling the project and doing updates becomes a nightmare. And you're always just kind of fighting against the previous updates, the other developers, or the previous code that you'd written. Assumption 2, which is nothing will change. So this is actually a quote from the BEM website, and that's BEM info, so BEM.info. And the idea is the website development process, if you're under this assumption that things won't change, you're incorrect, because websites evolve and change over time. That's the purpose of web. A lot of times people think that the only thing that's just going to be changing is the content, but there are a lot of things that happen. So technology shifts happen. You introduce new products. You have to design around the content. You need to make sure that you're bubbling it up and focusing it for the right experience, or making something custom. It's going to change over time. Change is actually really, really good. So from the initial concept that you're doing, you're going to be changing, and you should see that as a positive thing. So really, how can you deal with these changes, and how can you manage and maintain your code so it doesn't become unquality? Well, you can create a sustainable system that is flexible to meet ongoing and ever-changing projects' needs and wants. So kind of future-proofing for the unknowns that may be happening. This is one of my favorite quotes, and I actually forgot about it. So I was going through this presentation earlier, and it's like, I removed about a quarter, or about 75% of the slides. I was like, I have to leave this one here. But when you're thinking about the web, you're not designing web, you're not just designing pages, but a system of components that work and play well together. And it's really all around the content that you're building and creating something that is flexible to meet the various demands of the user. And how you can do this is you break your website into modules. And by that, I mean, you start thinking of the different pieces of your code. Again, don't think of it as just the landing page. Think of the landing page that's made up of a series of other little components. And those same components should be used from one page to another page. And it can even be broken up into sub-modules. So it's just a series of small pieces that come together like puzzle pieces. This is a great quote from Ben Callahan, founder of Sparkbox. And I love to give Ben a shout out whenever I can, but modularity is a requirement of maintainable systems. So breaking it down, making it be more modular, helps you maintain it over time, but it also helps speed up the development process because you'll avoid collision because two developers can actually be working on a similar like piece, but not be working on the exact same file. So they can be working on individual pieces that are then combined to then output the actual final piece. The last assumption here is we know what that does. And this is a common thing that as a developer, you think you know what it does and you go and update it. And especially if you do this in a production environment, which I'm guilty of, and you're like, I'm just gonna update this, I know what that does. So let's look at this example here. Let's say we have head here, it has this. And then we have these three classes here, or just two classes, left and right. So when you look at this, you're probably thinking that this has to do with an alignment, like maybe we're creating a grid, and it has a background color of white, it has a border of black, and they're gonna be circles. So maybe it's a grid that has two circles, and one's on the left and one's on the right. Makes sense, those are very semantic names. But then when you throw in the words eyes, and then you think about the other things that you had inside here. So you had head, you had left, right, and now we had eyes. And we see that the eyes are actually more stylistic and they're bringing in almost like a helper class to it. And now these eyes could be combined. And now if we look at the actual code here, and we have this head, the structure that has head class on the outer container, and then we have a child div inside there with eyes, and then two grandchildren that are in there with left and right with some content inside of it. Now when we put the code, the DOM next to the CSS, we can see how these two are married together, but it's really hard to identify what these two pieces do without these two being next to each other. In most development cases, I try to split my screen with left side, my HTML on the right side, my CSS, and once I have a framework built, I'm not even really looking at my CSS. But to have a setup like this is kind of more in the rarity. And what would happen is, say you were making an update on a site and you wanted to bring in left and right to create a grid, you would also be bringing in these styles that are like background color white. What if I don't want those? What if I just want something to be floating on the right versus on the left? So it also gets into this weird naming convention of knowing and assuming what we know something is, but then also giving it a convention that we think is right, but it's overly semantic and it's really unusable and unscalable. This is another example of like really realistic code and bad code. So you can see it says like container. It has section. It has like Kevin's section. It has a section of Bob stuff, and Bob stuff is in here. And there's a variety of IDs, classes, and weird naming conventions, camel casing versus whatever. So it looks like a bunch of people wrote code and they didn't know what they were doing. They just put it in there. But to make matters worse is you look at the CSS. And CSS, I've seen so much CSS in my life, and I've seen really bad examples of CSS like this before. So this is high specificity, so span being a direct descendant of the P being directly inside of the Kevin section. Typically, if I'm doing this presentation live, I'll be like, so what is the color of, and I'll point to one of the elements inside there to see if people will know if it's actually purple or if it's going to be red. So that's usually my question when I give this example. But basically, you should not be doing this stuff. That's bad code, and you see it all the time. And you should be writing it in a way that the selectors are really good. So, for example, when I say selectors, these are the classes that you're applying to your code. So inside, it's the way that you're selecting, I guess, the DOM elements to add stylistic to it. Majority of CSS is classes. I use a wide range of selectors, but classes are great. But when it comes to selectors, you're supposed to keep them short, meaning that the name should not be long. So don't do something like this, like something that's directly inside of that, which is then inside of a child, which is somewhere inside of this. So that's really how you would read that, but it's a long selector. And there's this rule called inception. And inception means that you should never go 3 levels deep. Rarely you can go 3 levels deep, but rarely should you do that. It's only meant for like name spacing or overriding if needed. And one of the things I want to call out is like how I read that too. So CSS is one of those languages, the selector right there. So the dot this, dot child, the greater than sign, that means the direct descendant. When you're reading a CSS class, you kind of read it backwards. So if this had the color red inside of it, I would say the color red is applied to something that's directly inside of that's directly inside of a child, that's somewhere inside of a this. And CSS selectors actually read backwards. And if you never thought about it that way, it helps you identify if your selector is too long and how long it takes you to say it. So try to keep them short. The second one is to reduce location dependency. So what this means is, like, if you have a selector that is like a namespacing. So say you have like sidebar that has a promo inside of it. So maybe the selector is like promo, which is inside of sidebar. That doesn't need to exist. Why not just make promo exist as its own selector and have those styles, and then add any type of modifier to it or any utility class to extend the look and feel of it. This allows you to then get into the next piece, which is you make it portable, meaning that you can reuse it from one place to another. You're creating agnostic selectors, so the names themselves are still semantic, but not overly semantic, meaning that they're not tied directly to what they are, but they're help the developers be able to communicate back and forth. Don't call your selectors things like R2, 792, call them something that someone would actually remember and know. But the idea is to make it be really usable and not just tied to what it is itself. So maybe a promo isn't the best example here, but instead of it being called a promo, you could call it like a content box. And then that content box could have some various styles that are attached to it that make it be a promo. And most importantly, again, I try to stress this, but decrease specificity and also remove like any type selectors. So anything like an H2 that has like H2.title, you want to avoid those types of things. It makes it really hard to do it. And specificity is one of the hardest things to overcome in CSS. I'm sure I'll get some questions about specificity, but it's really just the over declaring of a selector to apply some CSS properties. And there's some great videos out there. Harry or CSS Wizardry has ITCSS or ItCSS, where he talks about these things in depth. Maybe I'll post that in the comments below, but inside there, you want to decrease specificity. It just makes your life way easier and avoids collision. So how do we do all these things? And that's really where BEM comes in. And as I said yesterday, BEM is a methodology, and this is directly from beminfo.com. I'm a really horrible reader out loud, but basically it's a methodology, and what it allows you to do is you dissect your interface and you divide it into, I guess, blocks or ways that you can identify your content and the structure for it, for maintainability, reusability, and also scalability for content. And it's a great way to not just create libraries, but also to organize your code and have consistency in the development process from one developer to another and how you're communicating back and forth. BEM has three main entities. It's where the acronym comes from, so it's an acronym, block element modifier. By definition, a block is a building block that contains or holds content. And there's actually two types of them, which I'll come to at the end, which are simple and compound. So a block is the outermost container, and it contains content. Inside of a block, you have what's referred to as an element. An element performs a certain function inside of the interface, and it is very context dependent, meaning that an element has to live directly inside of a block, and blocks are associated, or elements are associated directly to the block itself. The last piece of it is a modifier, and a modifier is making a variant or a change to the block or element that exists out there. So what it does is you add modifications to it. As I was saying earlier, instead of calling something like sidebar promo, where promo is inside sidebar, you can call it promo. Instead of calling it promo, maybe call it content block, and then add a modifier to it that says content block promo. And then that way that code becomes really reusable. And then we have maybe a small variation to it if it needs to exist to make a promo stand out. Simple block, going back to that, is it contains only elements, or it only contains an element or elements, where a compound block means it contains other blocks inside of it. So you can have a block inside of a block. And elements don't have to be direct descendants of blocks themselves, and neither does a block inside of a block. You saw this in my last example, and I kind of build them out. When to decide when to break into a new block inside of a block and make it a compound block is based off of the pieces and parts of it, and really the CSS, so you can decrease the specificity inside there, and also to break it up into modular pieces that maybe two developers could be working on at the same time. So getting into the naming convention of these, so first the block, so it has it's a class, so these are actually dealing with class selectors, so you have dot block, but this could be dot, in my example, I think it was dot box, and then an element is identified as a double dash, so you have block double dash element, so the element is context dependent inside the block itself. It's identified by the two double underscores. The example I gave the other day was box double underscore pizza. And then we have modifier, which is identified as a double dash. So you have block double dash modifier. So in the example I gave was like box double dash large, so like a large box. And then inside there was pizza. But modifiers can also exist in various ways. The last one here is not really the best use case. I would kind of steer you away from ever using it. I think actually the recommendations from BEM.info say don't do this, but I've definitely seen it, and I don't get mad when I see this, but basically you try to avoid it. It probably means that you're making too many modified versions of it. You should just spin up a new version, because it becomes hard to maintain that and know what modifiers to use. But basically you can have a modifier on the block, you can have a modifier on the element, and that last case on both of them. So getting into a quick example here, just to kind of wrap this up, and similar to like the pizza one, but we'll use a human. So this is a block of code here. We have human and some children elements inside this block. So human here is the block, so dot human class. Inside of human, we have three elements, which are head, trunk, and legs. So this is just a simple block because it only contains elements inside of it, but three different various elements. So block, head, and whatever. And basically that's it. Like, I just wanted to give a quick little summary of this. Actually forgot that was my last slide here. So it was kind of an anticlimactic ending, but in reality, I just wanted to do a quick little overview about BEM, and hopefully this is helpful, and the other video is. And as we do deeper dives into videos, ask about questions, and I can spin off another short video like this. And again, you can watch the longer video of this presentation where I go through a navigation and some of the do's and don'ts and various types of it. It's a few years old, but it still holds up the test of time. That's the best part about BEM. As I've said, like, I use BEM on all my projects, and has become a way for myself and the development teams working with me to communicate and to find reuse from one project to another. That's all I have. So thank you for your time, and ask any questions in the comments, and please feel free to reach out to me. I'm Nicetransition on Twitter.